So today I want to tell you a little bit about what that means, and the goal really is to perhaps start to challenge the way that we typically do content and to see whether we can get more out of it by applying some basic ideas. So I'll jump straight in because I think I'm going to be pushed for time as well. So where this all really starts for context is about 4 or 5 years ago, I started looking at research, psychological research and other fields into how we actually process information as human beings. And the question that threw up for me, with other work I was doing at the time, is can we exploit some of these ideas and understanding of the way that our brain works in order to get people to actually engage with our content more and to get better content results? So we spend a lot of time worrying about what we write, but how much time do we spend worrying about how we present it? And if we use some tricks, some simple tricks, can we get better results? I think the answer is a resounding yes, and I hope to share some of that with you today. What I hope people listening to this will get out of it is an appreciation specifically of why visuals and interaction are important in content. So I'm going to focus on those two areas this morning, visuals and interaction. There are many other areas that you can look at that have an influence, but those are two of the biggest ones, so I'm going to focus on those this morning. I hope people will come away with some knowledge of how these affect the engagement with, persistence with, and retention of information, which is what we're fundamentally looking to do with our content. And hopefully people will come away with ideas on how they can start to improve the content that they create tomorrow or the content they're commissioning tomorrow. So it should hopefully be quite actionable and purposeful. So I'll start at the start with imagery. And we're going to start by looking at how imagery speaks to our primitive brain. So it's quite common people talk about how we have a conscious brain and we have a subconscious brain. And so I want to talk about how this speaks to our subconscious brain, because that's where we start to get this influence and we can see an impact with our content. So we're going to go back in time, about 40,000 years, to cave paintings. And these are really relevant because these are our first attempts at non-real-time communication. So prior to this, if you wanted to receive or give information, you had to be in the right place at the right time. But we started to use technology, very basic technology, walls and pigments, to put ideas in a way that was more permanent, that other people could come along and see later. And these weren't just decoration, they conveyed vital information. So information about resources, information about dangers and risks. And so these presented a real survival advantage to our ancestors 40,000 years ago. So if you were able to consume these and produce these and start to use the information that they conveyed, it's actually a survival advantage. So if you weren't able to do this, you would be evolved out. And this is really where our beginnings are with visual content. So it's important to note that. We fast forward 33,000 years and we come up to ideograms. So you'll notice here that these are still very pictorial, but instead of actually being descriptions, they're slightly abstracted. So you can still see there's like legs that are discernible and eyes and other shapes, but it's still pictorial, so we're still reading pictures is the important thing here. Now these are easier to read and write, they're more portable, so more people, it's more democratic, more people can do them, you don't have to be an artist. But it's still based on real visual concepts. Then 4,000 years ago, something really interesting happens, which is that we abstract those pictorial representations into letters, and we start to get the alphabet. And there's some really interesting psychology here about how we repurpose ancient neural networks to read. So we're not actually designed to read, we're repurposing other stuff that our brain typically does in order to read, which is fascinating, but I won't spend too long on that. And the thing that you notice with the alphabet is that the pictures are gone, except for that they're not. Because something really interesting happens when you read. The first thing that happens is that when you read a sentence, every possible meaning of every word is loaded up into your brain, and you make thousands of decisions around which meaning to use to properly parse the sentence. The other thing that happens is that when you read a word, the visual part of your brain becomes active, and you actually imagine that word subconsciously in the back of your mind. And as proof of this, or partly proof of this, it's the most common thing in the world that someone will read a book, and then they'll go and see the film, and then they'll say, well, that's not how I imagined it. There were no pictures in the book, right? But you created the story in your head. And the thing is that you do this subconsciously. Now, with fiction, you do it partly consciously because it's fun to do and it's a creative activity, but you do it no matter what you read. And so the thing is that although we've moved to the alphabet and we're reading in this very abstracted way, we still crave the images, and we make them when they're not there. And that's a really important thing to understand, because having those pictures helps us understand. It helps grease the wheels of understanding. It makes us remember things. So as a result of all of this, the electrical activity in our brains related to vision accounts for 2/3 of all electrical activity in our brains. Half of our neural tissue deals with vision in some way, and estimates are that up to 90% of our brain power is spent processing visuals. And this is even to the point where I read a study the other day with a researcher saying that we're actually starting to cannibalize our other senses. So this guy was saying that up to 60% of our genes related to smell have been permanently damaged by the rampant expansion of the visual cortex. Visual is so important to us that it's actually killing other senses, which is kind of amazing. So given that we know all of this, and this is all like very Googleable, you can find all this stuff, what do we typically do? Well, when we create digital content online, we're lucky if we have one image per page, right? Typically with a blog, it's like a token image at the top, like context setting. You scroll past, and then you're onto endless pages of unbroken scrolling text. I saw a website the other day that someone showed me where I was scrolling for a full minute to get to the bottom, and I think there were 2 images. This was absolutely insane, but it's not that uncommon. So the key thing is that this is not visually persuasive, right? So given everything that we know about how humans process information and the importance of images, we're missing a huge trick because we think that humans just read the text and that's enough. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately. So I'm kind of setting out a stall here. I'm saying, visuals are really important and we should use them. And then I'm saying that we don't do that enough today. And now I'd like to present some proof of what happens when you do actually start to use visuals effectively. So I want to talk about a few studies. The first one is around retention rates. So a study is done where a group are presented with a piece of content and it's just text. They read it, and they go away, they come back 3 days later, and the examiner asks, okay, tell me what you read. Typically, they can record around 10% of the information. They then repeat it, but they put contextual images along with the text. That 10% goes up to 65% by using contextual images. And this was the first piece of research that I came across those few years ago that really made me stop in my tracks, because this should be absolute gold dust to us as marketeers. Like, if we can get, by using images properly, if we can get people to remember our stuff 6.5 times better, we would actually be clinically insane not to do that. Like, you'd have to be mad. On social, we see images on Facebook constituted 93% in 2012 of the most engaging posts. So all the status updates, all the other things that people do, all the events, all of this kind of stuff, images were 93% of the most engaging posts because of our, this subconscious desire to have imagery. We love it. This next one is really interesting as well. So I believe this is 3M. They did a study where they looked at persuasion of content. And they found that, again, presenting text content or just verbal content, say 50% of people are persuaded by an argument. So if you're looking to convince someone of something, just doing it with text, say 50%. Depends on the argument, of course. If you then use visuals to support that, you actually persuade another 43% on top of that 50%, so it would go up to, say, 75% roughly, of your argument. So your argument hasn't changed. You're not saying anything new. You're just presenting your argument in a more persuasive way. And this is something that we kind of like to think as human beings, that we're sort of super rational and really smart, and like we just look at the evidence and then we make our decision, but we don't. We're really swayed by these things. It's really important to understand. And online articles with strong use of imagery get 94% more views than other articles. So that's what happens when it's done right. And to me, as I say, 3 or 4 years ago, this was the thing that really sparked my interest in this. And other people know this. So if you look at the news, the thing that you'll notice is that all the major news channels present in exactly the same way. The reason for this is that people like Sky and the BBC have spent tens of millions of pounds studying the best way to present the news. And they look at 3 factors. They look at engagement, so getting people to sit up and pay attention. They look at persistence, how long people are going to spend with the news. And they look at retention. After they've watched the news, what do they remember? And they found that the way that the news is presented is the way that the news is presented. And that's because that works best for us. And you'll notice it's highly visual, small amounts of text. And they support that, obviously, with commentary and other things. And this is not a cultural thing, because I started to wonder, well, maybe this is just something in the West, but it's not. Because if you go to North Korea, which I don't recommend, you'll find that the news is actually presented in exactly the same way. I'd take my word for that. You don't need to visit. So the key findings from this first section about visuals is, like, we are really wired for visual communication. It speaks to us at a primitive level. It speaks to the subconscious part of our brain. It is the most persuasive form of communication. So that's like a slightly different topic, which is around persuasion, which I'm not going to go into today, but it really is. And we can use it to improve the performance of our content, and it's not even hard. It's not even like you have to do a whole great deal of work. You just have to apply that kind of that mentality. And we should pay more attention to how we do it, because it's basically free to get these performance benefits. So that's visuals. I'm going to move on now to talk about interaction, which is another one of the big pillars of effective content. So this is about shifting the brain from a passive state to an active state and bringing a smile to the mind. So we've all had experiences, normally in our B2C lives, where something has been entertaining and enjoyable, and we've had an experience maybe with an app on a smartphone or on an iPad that is just great fun, and you keep coming back for more. And it's not always necessarily a game. It can be other stuff. So people have studied this, and we have to do a couple of definitions here before we get started. So people identify two types. This is psychology now. We've moved into psychology. Two types of motivation. The first is extrinsic, which is stuff that you do because you have to. So this is filling in your tax return. Unless you're a masochist, filling in your tax return is something that you do because you have to. I don't want that knock at the door. Intrinsic is playing with your kids. It's something that generally, it depends on the game, but generally playing with your kids is fun and enjoyable. It's an intrinsically motivating thing. And those are the two definitions that we need for this next section. So it will come as no surprise, but when a goal is an intrinsically framed goal, when it's something that you want to do, you do it better. This is obvious, but people have studied this at great length. They find that intrinsic goal framing leads to deeper engagement. You'll notice these three things come up a lot in this talk. Deeper engagement, better retention of information, and higher persistence across all activities. So put a simple way, this is something that we all know. You're good at what you like. We're all good at what we like because we stick to it, we enjoy it, and we carry on and we go through. So for us as content creators, that's great to know. Okay, we need to make content that people want to engage with. That's kind of obvious. But how do we do that? Well, again, our friends, the psychologists, have got ideas for us. And there's something called self-determination theory. And this dictates or suggests three things that you need to do with an experience to make it intrinsically motivating. And we'll look at these now. The first one is competence. You want to feel like you were competent when you were doing this experience. So you don't want it to be too stressful, but equally you don't want it to be too bland. So scrolling up and down a web page does not display competence. Like doing something like filling in answers to a quiz online, that displays competence. You have to understand the questions, you have to interact, you have to do something, your brain is working. That's the key thing. And when you do that, you get a secondary effect, which is that having more blood flowing through your brain actually increases your ability to retain information. And so even little things like tapping your foot. I used to be a doodler at school. I used to incessantly doodle, and I always thought it was because I had bad attention and I was lazy. Turns out doing that causes the blood to flow to your brain, and you're actually remembering stuff better. Really interesting. The second thing you need to feel is relatedness. So people always talk about personalized content and things like this. It's really important because having the piece of content know something about you, or even being able to put something of yourself into the content. So things like questions, again, a quiz is great. Answering polls, looking at data, things like that. Feeling of relatedness, you're bound to the content in some way. And then you also want to experience autonomy. People don't like to be dictated to. So again, scrolling up and down a web page, you're on a train track. You're going from A to B and you can't control it. People want to be in a car exploring the side roads, on the B roads and over the fields and stuff. We don't like being dictated to. And if you can find ways to do that with content, then you're going to have an intrinsically motivating experience, so the theory suggests. But let's put that to the test. So this is all very well and theoretical and interesting, but how does this play out? So, sorry, I'm a bit previous. So the status quo is these passive experiences, fundamentally, they're not interactive. PDF is not interactive. You scroll up and down and you're bored. Everyone knows scroll fatigue. Typically, articles online, you're lucky if people read 20% of the words. They're scrolling up and down. Forget it, Same with web pages. Interaction and engagement is very limited. So what happens when you do this right? Like, given what I've just said, we should expect some quite extraordinary results if we start to do interactive content properly. And lo and behold, you do. So this is a survey that was done in 2014 looking at content effectiveness at educating the buyer. So you can see over here in the very effective column, 45% of interactive content was rated as very effective at educating the buyer versus 6% of passive content. And we want to educate our buyer. We want to educate people. We want to influence them. So we should start thinking a bit more seriously about interactive content because, for every pound that we spend on passive content, we're missing a huge trick. There's loads more that can be gained by looking at things a bit differently and not settling for the status quo. Just because everyone else does it doesn't mean that we have to. We're smarter. So the key findings there is that intrinsic motivations are extremely powerful. Interactive content, when it's done well, results in dramatically improved performance. And that we have established principles on how to create this intrinsic motivation. So that was the self-determination theory. So pulling all of these together, I want to introduce someone who's really fascinating. This is Marshall Mcluhan. Hands up if anyone's heard of Marshall Mcluhan. Fantastic, good stuff. So he's credited as being the godfather of modern media theory. He's also credited with having predicted the internet and social media back in the 70s. He's a fascinating guy and a really deep thinker. And one of his most famous pronouncements is the medium is the message, and way back in 1964. And what he meant by this for our purposes is as follows. This is the most succinct statement I found of it. The form of a medium embeds itself in any message it would transmit or convey, creating a symbiotic relationship by which the medium influences how the message is perceived. So if we stop and think, this is exactly what I've been saying up to this point. At no point have I said change your messaging. At no point have I said change your content, your structure, anything like that. I've just said focus a bit more time on the medium, and you get dramatic results, as we saw in those examples previously. So to my mind, I feel like most people miss a huge trick because we focus all of our resources on the message and we don't take enough account of the medium. So we focus entirely on what we think we are, which is rational human beings, and we neglect what we actually are, which is fundamentally quite irrational human beings with a layer of rationality on the top. We need to speak to that more primitive lizard brain that craves this information. And so we miss half the equation. So the example that I always give with this is, and this is very typical, I'm sure people can relate to this. I want to buy a product or a service, and so I go on Google and I start typing. I click on some ads. People are paying money to get me to their site, which is, great. I go there, I look around the site, I find the product I'm interested in. Things are going really well. And then it pops up and it says, to read more, to download our white paper, to find out about our product, please fill in your name and your email address. And you do, and you fill it in. And this is like the golden moment, because I've expressed real interest. I want to know about this company. I want to know about their product, and they want to tell me. It's like a match made in heaven. And I fill in my details, and what do I get? Download PDF. And I'm always disappointed. I download the PDF, and I'm scrolling through, and it's boring, and I'm not enthusiastic. And suddenly there's 10 other things that I'd rather do. Like, everyone knows this. You get that PDF, it's 50 pages, and suddenly that email that you had this morning becomes really interesting and really important. Like, any excuse not to wade through this dry document. You'll come to it later in the day, possibly, but it's kind of a killer. It kills the mood. It's not good. And so, I said at the start that this was something that I've, spent the last 3 or 4 years looking at. And we now help big companies do this. So companies like Deutsche Telekom, Cisco, British Land, The Economist. And these are the kind of results that we typically see just by applying these basic principles. So it's not uncommon for us to take 2-minute average read times up to 5-minute average read times by applying these, because you make the experience more enjoyable and more interactive and more engaging, and people want to stick with it. Typically, we can increase subscriptions and the quality of those subscriptions. So by asking for people's details within the content after they've engaged and they've had a good experience, you actually get more subscriptions and you get increased quality. So the kind of sales call after filling in one of those forms I mentioned before and downloading the PDF, people ring up and they don't remember who you are. You say, oh, you downloaded our report on X, Y, and Z. And the person at the other end says, oh, I have no idea. I don't remember that report. What are you talking about? Who are you? Please go away. But if you do it with a memorable experience that's engaging, when you pick up the phone, they say, oh, I remember you. You did that report on so-and-so. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed reading that. And they know it's memorable. They persisted the information. And we also typically increase reach for all of these customers. So because it's more interactive and more engaging, people want to show it to other people. They send it on to their colleagues. They share it on Twitter. They share it on LinkedIn because it's an engaging experience that they had fun with. So thanks for listening. We've really just scratched the surface. There's so much of this around how we can influence people with our content. But I hope that everyone will go away from today thinking just a tiny bit different about the content that they're planning to create tomorrow, because there's so much untapped potential in there that we can be taking advantage of. So thank you very much for listening. If anyone is really interested in this, please do come and find me and talk about it. I'm always interested to carry on the conversation, or find me on Twitter, or we have a stand as well if you're interested to talk. So thank you very much for listening. Hopefully that was interesting and entertaining in equal measure. Thank you.